God questions. Honest answers.
Welcome to God Questions.
Honest answers.
I'm Ross, he's Mark, and we're glad to be with you for another question. Do
Yes.
Christians have to forgive?
Ooh, that is a great
That's a
question.
great question. But before we
Yes.
get there, Mark.
We've got other questions to ask.
Yeah, what
And-
question do you have to ask? Right off the top of your head. Here we go.
Here's what
I know you
wonder.
didn't plan a question for me today. Did you?
No, but I've got.
Yes, I got you.
I mean, I've got something I wanted to know.
Oh, okay. So you did kind of plan.
Kind of. So it wasn't really planned. It's just been building. So like we do this podcast, right? And we're
Yeah.
talking, and we're sitting in a room without the people who are listening to us.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. And so we're talking to these invisible people who some of them we maybe know a name because they like emailed us a question.
They do sometimes.
But a lot of the people listening we don't know. So
True.
here's my question to you is as you were talking to these people who we don't know, what do they look like in your brain? Tell me about the person who's listening
Yeah.
to this podcast. Describe, because right now there's somebody who's listening to this. They're somewhere doing something. What are they doing?
Going through the grocery store picking out bread right now.
Okay, so you are currently in the grocery store picking up bread. We're talking about you.
That'd be interesting.
Ross, what
That'd
do
be
they look
actually
like?
Very shocking. Normal. They're wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and they're just the backwards hat. Am I describing me? Yeah.
So you're
That's
really
me.
just talking to yourself. So when you are doing this podcast, you're thinking like, I'm
What
talking
do-
to myself out there.
I'm thinking, like, what do I want to hear after this? No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. Do you ever listen? Do you listen? Do you listen to the podcast yet?
I try not to.
Me
Mainly, it's. I don't. Maybe
Is that bad for the rap? We should ask the lady. We should ask our PR.
She's
Maybe.
She's forced to
It's
listen to us.
it's sometimes hard to listen to what I already know I'm going to say.
Right, or
But
to
just
listen to
kidding,
my
I
own
listen.
voice.
Oh, that too.
See, like I don't mind the parts of the podcast where you're talking, but then I start talking.
That's how I feel too. So I fast forward all my parts and listen to you.
Right. Do you watch?
I do watch you.
Okay. All right.
So anywhere you are, you're listening to a few guys who have a hard time listening to their own voices.
Right, but we think our voices are that bad that you should.
We
listen
just got
to.
very deep. Our PR person in the background saying, "Stop." No.
Stop. There's a question to answer.
But we don't, when record hits, we can't stop.
Nope, we can't. There's no going back.
Okay, here we go.
All right.
Do Christians have to forgive? And will our PR person forgive us? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Forgiveness is a big
really
deal. It is really awesome. Forgiveness is a big deal, though.
Yeah, it is.
If we think of it in our world today, forgiveness is necessary. It's needed in a lot of situations. So, yes, God commands those who follow him to forgive. So we're going to paint a Christian as a person, which defined rightfully so, who follows Jesus. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're in a committed relationship with Christ.
Right.
That's what a Christian is.
Right. And so
They've surrendered their life. They've believed and confessed. That's what a Christian is. All right.
So a Christian is somebody who believes that Jesus who says he is and does what he says.
Yep.
Or at least does their best
Yeah.
to try.
Yeah. So is forgiveness, do Christians have to forgive? Yes, that's God commands them to go. But I believe there's a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, which is also often the hiccup.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I don't know. Start unpacking.
Well, I think it's very, it's not just forgiveness, reconciliation. I think that's part of it. I think there's this whole spectrum because I think over here you have the forgetting, right?
Yeah.
So we can talk about that. So forgetting all the way to reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think forgiveness lies in between. So that first part where you're asking between the forgiveness and reconciliation, those are two different things.
Mm-hmm.
I think reconciliation requires forgiveness.
Yeah.
But forgiveness can happen without reconciliation. And the reason is that because reconciliation is all about relationship, right? It takes two people to be reconciled to each other. And so it takes two people forgiving one another, accepting forgiveness and reconciling, where forgiveness can happen just in my own place. And not every relationship where forgiveness needs to happen, because we're commanded to forgive, is going to end in reconciliation.
Yep.
And if reconciliation is the end product, it may not be immediate. It may be years down the road. It may be weeks down the road. It may be a couple of days, right? I can forgive you and you can accept that, but I'm not quite ready. You know, there's work that has to be done.
Yeah.
And so I think there's that distinction that forgiveness is what we're commanded to do. As a follower of Jesus, I'm told to forgive. And so I need to do that. And forgiveness isn't also just a simple I forgive you and done. It's this ongoing, right? The moment you, and listeners, you probably experience this, right? Where you forgive somebody, and then like the next moment you're all of a sudden you realize you're like angry at that person again. You have to like, but you're like, I just forgave him. And then you have to like re-forgive them. And it's just this kind of ongoing process of forgiveness. And so, yeah, but that's distinct from reconciliation. I think reconciliation is a good thing, but it is different than it's a longer process because it is two people.
Yep.
Yeah,
and it may take time, but there's a way to forgive without entering reconciliation immediately. Right, is what you're getting at, and I agree.
Yeah,
I think there's also the forgiving and forgetting. There's this piece of sometimes we wonder and connect the two. If I forgive, I ought to forget. But seriously, if we think through just maybe some sinful offenses that have happened to you or someone who sinned against you in a certain manner that it's probably unwise to forget what they've done because of maybe other safety or issues, or maybe they're not, you haven't reconciled the relationship. And so forgiving and forgetting is not in the Bible in the sense of like you should forgive to just forget what happened to you.
Right.
But we shouldn't harbor it in bitterness and hatred. We should forgive the sin against us, but we should act in wisdom. And maybe there's a scenario where you were abused physically, sexually, whatever, that you can truly offer sincere forgiveness. But wisdom would tell you, you certainly shouldn't forget and just dismiss and pretend that didn't happen. That still happened, and there's a road to recovering that for you, and then most likely for the other person, and even reconciling that relationship, but also them going through a process of consequences and walking through their own side of receiving the forgiveness from you, and hopefully asking for forgiveness and being remorseful or regretful, or being in a place where they are sorry for that act. But sometimes we don't get there, and so forgetting part, that's certainly not the case when Jesus says to forgive. That he's just saying, well, just forget and hope it never happens.
Yeah, because and I think you bring up that big piece of consequence, right? That when we say there is a consequence, and so forgiveness isn't doing away with that, right? I think even just in a simple thing, when I think about this, I think of like Charlie Brown. I think and like there's always, is it Lucy, the one who always like had him try to kick the football and she always pulled it away?
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know how many versions of that there are out there, but it's like this repeated thing where there's always this conversation about, you're going to pull it away, and no, I'm not. And she just kept doing it, right? And so Charlie Brown was just forgetting. He's like, oh, well, it's not going to happen this time, right? And he kept getting hurt, and he was bearing the consequence for that. And so I do think that we can forgive, but you don't forget, like the consequence has to be paid. And in the same way that we are told to forgive, we're told to forgive because we've been forgiven. And when Jesus forgives us our sin, he doesn't just, the consequence is still out there, right? The sin still has to be dealt with. And it's not just like magically erased, all right? If you owe me $5 and I forgive you that debt, then I still am left with $5 that's owed, right? I'm out the money. And so there's a difference. It's not I think that's an important distinction to kind of wrestle through.
Forgetting, And so maybe the two categories we can focus the rest of our time on now is just the when should we forgive? And it's often and always. I mean, the when is like when we walk through a scenario and someone sinned against us, the when is any time then through processing that sin committed against you to come to a conclusion of forgiving them. It could take days, a season, months, sure, but we should be in a progress of offering forgiveness and not holding on to bitterness and hatred and division between a person, even amidst their sin. Now, I think that where we might get stuck is, do we forgive people? Like, when do we forgive people who don't ask or are not in a place to believe they need forgiveness? And that's rather difficult. Yeah. And that's when the when becomes, I think, solely on no, we're commanded to forgive, and harboring bitterness and hatred is not of God. And so how we reflect in the when probably is, may look different, but it's still just as important to extend forgiveness to those who maybe don't even ask for it.
Yeah, because that's
probably may never ask for it.
Those are two really different things, right? Like, I come up to you and I'm like, Ross, I am so sorry. I did this, and will you forgive me? Like,
It's easier to forgive.
It's easier to forgive versus somebody who's like, dude, you just like bashed the door of my car and put a huge dent in it, and you're just like, whatever.
Yeah.
My car still looks better, right? But we're called to forgive.
Yeah.
And that is really hard. Somebody who's seeking forgiveness versus somebody who could care less.
Yeah.
And yet, regardless, we're committed to forgive.
Yeah.
And so those do take, like, forgiveness is still the same thing, but it definitely is harder when the person who's wronged us doesn't care, doesn't seek forgiveness, or maybe is still continuing to harm. Yeah. Right? Then that. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's the hard thing, I think, with discerning the win is like,
always, and often.
Always and often, but also like you really got to be in a place where you recognize like how God has forgiven you through the work of Christ. Yeah. And like the magnitude of that. Like Jesus bore the wrath of God, took on like a substitute for your sin. Like he literally bore it all to forgive you. Right. Even to the extent of like obviously death on the cross, and all that, and being beaten and, shamed. And it's like this imagery that like when we take that and we understand it fully for ourselves, that person who you feel like doesn't ask for forgiveness, they don't deserve it. And you recognize, I didn't deserve the forgiveness that God offered either. Mm-hmm. You then are empowered to say, yeah, right, I get where you're at. And I still want to forgive you because I know that in light of God's forgiveness for me, it's a similar deal. Right. I don't deserve it. I'm not, I didn't do anything to earn it. I didn't, in some regards, like didn't even ask for it before. But when I met you, Jesus, I recognized I needed it. And I certainly asked for it. And I've come to this conclusion that I trust you, Christ, and I give you my life.
Man,
and like,
that's good.
You respond to that forgiveness, and that's like really powerful.
Right. Yeah, well, that's that whole part of Romans 5, right? That while we were enemies, Christ died for us, right? He forgave us when we weren't looking for it. Yeah. And so again, as we understand that, when we understand the weight of our own offense against a holy God, and when we understand how even just in human relationships, as I understand how I've been forgiven, right? I'm not a perfect person. Mm-hmm. I've made mistakes. I've had to ask for forgiveness from people. Same. And as I've been forgiven, that helps me understand that I'm not the perfect one who's being offended. The perfect one who was offended was God by me, and yet he forgave me. And so, so how much or how often do we forgive? Always and often. But so then that other question then is, well, how much do you forgive?
What's the end to forgiveness?
Right.
And Jesus talks about that when Peter comes to him in Matthew 18, verse 20 to 23. He says, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Mm-hmm. I think that's a typical question any of us could ask, right? Right. And Jesus, what he does is he answers. He says, I tell you, not even 7 times, but 77 times. And what he's really getting after is not for us to do the math and start the tally sheet. Okay. What he's really saying is it's not to be counted. Like you don't count after how many times you forgive them, but you have a heart and a transformed life in which you look to them and always sincere desire of forgiveness because you've been forgiven. And that's where we see highlighted in Ephesians 4:32, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as in Christ God forgave you. Because the personal work of Christ, I mean, that's how God is able to, he redeems to receive us and forgive us in Christ, that we're able to be like in communion, like commune with God, but also know him and to have a relationship with him because of Christ. And so that's that area where Jesus is really challenging. It's not a tally mark system you create, right? And you get to the point of doing the math and you're like, I did this many times. And Jesus said, that's enough. He's like, nope. It's a how much, it's as much as needed, as much as possible through life. And
that's often and always. Yeah. And so that's interesting. So we get to that question, like, are Christians commanded to forgive? Yes. And so how much, how often? It's always and in all things, because again, if we are imitators of Christ, then right, as Christians, we believe that he is God, and we're called to be imitators of him, and he forgave the sins of the world. Yeah. And so that's my benchmark. So until I get to the point of being perfectly holy and having a world that is sinned against me and I forgive that, then I just need to keep working on forgiveness.
Yeah. And the beautiful part is that Jesus isn't calling us to diminish the sins against us, and in comparison to how we've been forgiven, from God, to say, well, it's just not a big deal. It is still a big deal when we sin against each other. When someone sins against us, it's still a huge deal. Right. But the act and way of forgiveness, I think oftentimes it does a lot between that relationship and bringing reconciliation, but it does a lot in our heart too. It allows us to let go of the bitterness and hatred that we may carry for someone that causes then us to sin against them, but also it honors God in the way he commanded us. Right. And I think it's like for our holiness, for our righteousness in him, that we're able to practice forgiving. Yeah. And so maybe you have a person in your life that you're just listening now and you need to pause and don't even close the episode with us and call and offer forgiveness to, who's sinned against you or wronged you in some way. We'd encourage you to do that. That's what that's what God commands us to do. And so we would encourage you to give a moment and go offer forgiveness in a real genuine way. I think of it sometimes we can be like kids, me included, when a kid, right now we have young kids in the house and we say, you need to say you're sorry, ask for forgiveness, or you need to forgive. And we're just like, I forgive you, but not really, Forgiveness is really genuinely from your heart. And so maybe taking time to pray through and ask God to lead you in that direction, or even discern what words or where can it genuinely come from your heart instead of just a duty. It's not what Jesus is after. He's after your heart. And so encourage you to do that. And thanks for the question. Yeah. And it is a process, that it's this continual, lifelong process of learning to forgive. Yeah. And so that's, it's good. It's hard. It's good. Thanks a lot for asking the question. Yes. Forgive us, Communications Director, PR lady, for that front end of the episode. That was crazy. We just went off the rails. That's the fun part. When you hit record, the button's stuck. We can't undo it. You can't undo it. It's fantastic. So we're just as honest as real as it gets, I guess. That's right. So keep sending us questions. You can send them to me, mark@ehope.org. O-R-G. Yep. It's great to have it .org. That's cool. Like and subscribe. Love you guys. Until the next time, I'm Ross Heathmark. This is God Question. Honest Answers. Peace. Bye.